When we talk about Mussolini and Italian fascism, the first thing that usually comes to mind is those super choreographed military parades, massive architecture, and fiery speeches with a whole lot of dramatic hand gestures. But what about regular people? What was real life like under fascism? If you think fascist Italy was some kind of utopia of order and progress, buckle up, because reality was a whole different story. Today, we're going to tear apart fascist propaganda and show you what life was actually like under Mussolini. Get ready, because the truth might be way more shocking than your history books let on. If you've ever read 1984 by George Orwell, you already know how a government that controls everything, what you say, what you think, plays out. Now, imagine 1984, but run by an Italian guy with a Napoleon complex. Or maybe you've seen Life is Beautiful, that amazing movie that starts off lighthearted and charming, only to punch you in the gut later. Well, life in fascist Italy was kind of like that. At first, it seemed like things were getting better, but in the end, yeah, not so much. Hey Discovers, real quick before we dive back in, I've got a small favor to ask. If you love historical curiosities, epic battles, crazy mysteries, and mind-blowing stories that most people don't know about, then hit that subscribe button right now. That way, you won't miss any of our new videos and can keep uncovering insane facts every week. And of course, smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow and brings you even more awesome content. Alright, let's jump back into history. Before we talk about Mussolini and his obsession with theatrical speeches, we need some context. Post-World War I, Italy was an absolute mess. Think of an episode of Peaky Blinders, but instead of the Shelby Gang, you've got workers on strike, peasants seizing land, and a government that had zero control over anything. What was going on? The economy was wrecked after the war. Unemployment was through the roof, and people were pissed. Massive strikes were happening everywhere. Factories were occupied by workers, and peasants were literally taking over land. Politicians? Useless. Governments kept collapsing left and right. And to make things worse, the fear of a communist revolution had the elites and middle class in full-on panic mode. If Red Dead Redemption 2 taught you anything, it's that progress and chaos go hand in hand. Italy in 1920 was exactly that. A country split between those demanding radical change and those willing to do whatever it took to stop them. And in the middle of this mess came a certain ex-journalist with a peculiar taste for black uniforms and catchy slogans. Now, picture this. You're playing Game of Thrones, if that were a thing back then, and some side character suddenly rallies a militia to storm the capital and seize the throne. Sounds like a solid episode, right? Well, that's basically what happened in Italy in 1922. What went down? Mussolini and his blackshirts, a gang of guys who thought beating people up was a valid political strategy, started attacking strikes, unions, and anyone who seemed dangerous to the status quo. The elites loved this because, in their minds, anything was better than a communist revolution. So, in October 1922, Mussolini decided it was time to make his move. He organized the famous March on Rome, where thousands of blackshirts marched to the capital. But, despite what fascist propaganda would later claim, this wasn't some epic military coup. It was more like a political pressure play. The government was so weak that instead of fighting back, the king simply invited Mussolini to form a new government. Yep, the guy basically took power because no one wanted to deal with the mess. And what happened next? Total censorship. Newspapers, radio, everything was controlled by the state. All other political parties? Banned. Opponents? Arrested, exiled, or killed. Strikes? Forget it. Now, they were illegal. If you've seen Star Wars, you've seen this movie before. A messy democracy, a charismatic leader promising to restore order, and boom. Suddenly, it's an empire instead of a republic. Mussolini sold the idea that he was bringing stability to Italy. But in reality, he just swapped one kind of chaos for another. Only now, it marched in sync and shouted, "Viva il Duce!" Now that Mussolini was in charge, Italy became one big social experiment. And if you think modern political propaganda is bad, imagine living in a country where every newspaper, every radio station, and even schools only talked about how great Mussolini was. What was going on? The media was 100% controlled by the government. If anything bad about Mussolini came out, someone was about to disappear. schools brainwashed kids into loving fascism. Textbooks were filled with Mussolini speeches and illustrations, making him look like some kind of demigod. Posters everywhere glorified Mussolini. It felt like a cult, but it was just another Tuesday in fascist Italy. Total surveillance. The government encouraged people to snitch on their neighbors. If someone suspected you of thinking wrong, you could get reported. If 1984 had an Italian version, this would be it. Except, instead of Big Brother, it was Mussolini's face plastered on massive posters with some motivational slogan. Or, to put it in modern terms, remember the boys? Where Homelander is marketed as the perfect hero, but in reality, he's a dictator in disguise. Well, Mussolini was the real-life Homelander, just with a less flashy costume. And in practice, life in Italy turned into one big performance where everyone had to act happy and patriotic, even when things were falling apart. Questioning the regime? Not an option. Everything had to be tutto bene, even when it obviously wasn't. The government wanted to create the illusion of a strong, united country. But reality, that was a whole different story. And it became even more obvious when Mussolini started messing with the countryside. If there's one thing dictators love, it's a flashy propaganda campaign to make it look like they're solving problems. And Mussolini was no different. One of his regime's brilliant ideas was the battle for grain, a plan to make Italy self-sufficient in food production. On paper, it sounded amazing. In practice, it was a disaster. What happened? The government forced farmers to grow more and more wheat, promising it would strengthen the economy. But no one invested in technology, fertilizers, or infrastructure. Basically, the idea was produce more however you can. Farmers who didn't meet the government's targets were financially punished. The result? Small farmers got screwed, and the country still had to import wheat. If you've played Stardew Valley, you know farm life can be tough. Now imagine that instead of running your farm how you want, some random bureaucrat from Rome shows up and tells you exactly how much wheat you need to grow, or else. And you don't get better fertilizers, tools, or any incentives. In the end, did production increase? To some extent, yes. But at the cost of destroying diversified farming. Farmers who once grew a variety of crops were forced to focus only on wheat. What did that mean? More hunger for the poor. Because, surprise, wheat doesn't solve everything when you don't have meat, fruits, and vegetables. Mussolini sold this story as a great victory for the regime. But for those living in rural areas, it was just another way for the government to take everything it could while giving nothing in return. And if you think urban workers had it any better, well, stick around, because the next topic is going to show you they definitely didn't. Think your boss is exploiting you? Imagine living in a system where the government sets your salary, bans unions, and turns any complaint into a crime. Welcome to the life of urban workers in fascist Italy. What happened? Independent unions? Forget it. Only state-controlled unions existed, and they were more about obeying than actually helping workers. Strikes? Not a chance. Protesting for better conditions was seen as an attack on the regime. The result? Prison, beatings, or, in some cases, a not-so-friendly visit from the blackshirts. Salaries? Set by the government. And, of course, always kept low to keep the big industrialists happy. Work hours? Excessive, with no right to negotiate. If you've seen Modern Times by Charlie Chaplin, remember that scene where he gets sucked into the factory gears? Now imagine that, but without the funny part. Or, for a more modern comparison, ever played Cyberpunk 2077? You know that world where megacorporations control everything, and workers are just disposable pawns? That was basically fascist Italy. Except instead of futuristic corporations, it was the government screwing you over. In practice, Mussolini claimed he created a system where employers and employees lived in harmony. But in reality, workers were trapped in a structure that only benefited factory owners. No negotiations, no rights, and anyone who tried to challenge the system was silenced. While propaganda showed images of happy, productive workers, the reality was exploitation and misery. And for women, well, it was even worse. Stick around because the next topic is going to show you why. If you think workers had it bad under fascism, wait until you hear about the situation for women. To Mussolini, a woman's role was simple. Get married, have kids, and produce more Italians to serve the state. What happened? The government encouraged early marriages and big families. The more kids a woman had, the more prizes she could earn. Women who didn't marry or have kids were looked down upon. If they wanted to work, they faced discrimination and much lower wages than men. In some cases, single women were considered unpatriotic because they weren't contributing to population growth. Education for women was cut back. The ideal was for girls to learn how to be good wives, not independent professionals. If you've watched The Handmaid's Tale, you'll recognize the idea of a government controlling women's lives and turning them into baby factories. Or remember Mad Men, that show where women are constantly underestimated and stuck in outdated roles? It was basically that, except without the 1960s glamour and with way more state oppression. In practice, Mussolini's idea was to create a strong, militarized society, starting with the family. But instead of providing real support for women, the regime just imposed rules, expecting them to sacrifice any personal ambition to serve the state. The result: women had fewer rights, fewer opportunities, and a society that became even more unequal. And as if that wasn't bad enough, things got even worse during the war when even food started running out. If you've ever complained about the price of groceries, imagine living in a country where even bread was rationed, and the government could just take your food. Welcome to Fascist Italy during World War II. What happened? As the country plunged into war, resources started disappearing. Basic foods like bread, milk, and meat were handed out in tiny portions by the government. But, of course, the elite and regime insiders always found a way to get more food than the rest of the population. Farmers hid grains to prevent them from being confiscated by the state. The black market boomed, and those with money could access better food. If you've seen Dunkirk, you know war isn't just about gunfire and explosions. Resource shortages hit everyone. Now imagine that situation, but without Hans Zimmer's intense music to make it feel epic. Or, for the gamers, remember Fallout? Where people scavenge for food and struggle to survive in a chaotic world. Fascist Italy during the war wasn't too far from that, except instead of mutants and radiation, it was Nazi soldiers and starvation. In practice, while the regime's propaganda insisted everything was under control, the people were starving. The truth was that the war drained Italy's resources, and even Mussolini knew he couldn't sustain the country for much longer. But admitting that was unthinkable, so the solution was to tighten control even more. In the end, fascism's promises of prosperity collapsed, and the Italian people paid a huge price. And that's exactly what we'll see in the conclusion. So, in the end, what did Mussolini really deliver to Italy? He promised order, progress, and a glorious empire. What did the people actually get? Hunger, censorship, exploitation, and repression. What did we learn? Fascism destroyed democracy and turned Italy into a police state. Workers lost their rights and became disposable cogs in the state's machine. Women were reduced to baby factories to fuel Mussolini's vision. The countryside was overexploited, and the economy never reached the promised self-sufficiency. The war brought shortages, rationing, and even more suffering for the people. If you watched this video hoping to find out that fascism at least brought some stability to Italy, surprise, it didn't. In the end, Mussolini fell, was captured and executed, and Italy had to rebuild everything from scratch. Fascism sold itself as the solution to Italy's problems, but in reality, it just made the people suffer while Mussolini and his allies lived in luxury. In the end, it was a regime of propaganda, repression, and empty promises. And now, I want to hear from you. What shocked you the most about life in fascist Italy? Drop a comment, and let's discuss. And of course, subscribe to the channel, because we're here to uncover history's hidden truths. See you in the next video.